Hi, everyone. So today I want to talk a little bit about desegregation in public schools. This is one of the contexts in which we see institutional race-based, ethnic, and racial discrimination. I'm going to walk a little bit through some of the patterns that we see, a little bit of the history behind it, and maybe even some mechanisms that could be used to address segregated schools, as well as some of the consequences of racially segregated educational settings. So we've talked about this a little bit previously. We talked a little bit about the way in which the late 1940s and the early 1950s were a period in which the previously legal racial segregation of American education systems was beginning to get sort of dismantled. We had Mendez v. Westminster in Los Angeles back in the 1940s, I think 1947. We get Brown v. Board of Education, of course, in 1954. So we begin to see the Supreme Court starting to step in and overturn previous rulings that had established the legality of the racial segregation of public schools. So, as I've mentioned before, also remember that institutional discrimination is fairly deeply entrenched. Individual level discrimination can be problematic, but at the end of the day, it's a relatively easy problem to solve compared to dismantling systems of discrimination, in part because the way that those systems are designed and operated, and the policies are worded, especially in the late 20th and now the early 21st century, it's very, very hard to point to specific language that expressly states an intent or desire to create racially discriminatory outcomes. So let's look at 1954, right? So Brown v. Board of Education is decided in 1954. Public school systems across the United States are now legally required to desegregate. One of the most famous cases in which there was a lot of resistance to desegregation was, of course, at Little Rock High School, or Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. That was in 1955 and 1956. The governor of Arkansas, at the time, a man named Orville Faubus, attempted to delay the implementation of Brown by filing a case and having it go to the Supreme Court. So he was arguing for time, right, to continue to be able to establish or reestablish racially segregated schools in Little Rock, Arkansas, under the argument that desegregating the public schools would lead to increased violence. And the suit went nowhere. The Supreme Court said, no, you have to desegregate your schools. And so in 1957, Faubus actually took the very, very dramatic step of canceling all public schools, closing all public schools in the state of Arkansas. The idea that if schools have to be desegregated, then maybe we shouldn't have schools open at all. So very dramatic sort of response, and that year, that academic year, has become known as the lost year. The point that I'm hopefully driving home here is that these states, especially southern states, but it's happening in other places in the U.S. as well, but not surprisingly, a lot of the strongest resistance is in states that were formerly part of the Confederacy. The resistance is quite dramatic. It's very pronounced. It's not as though the people said, "Oh, okay, we'll go along with this now." There was a significant pushback. One of the forms that takes is the establishment of what are called segregation academies. Segregation academies are private schools, so they're not public, and as such, the assumption is they're not subject to the the restrictions or the requirements placed on public institutions, right? So the private sector is often granted much more latitude relative to the public sector. Laws apply to public institutions, but may not necessarily apply in the same way to private institutions. So from 1954 to 1976, we see the establishment of dozens and dozens of these segregation academies that are expressly set up so that white parents can send their children to racially segregated schools. So they're private schools, they're racially segregated. And again, in 1976, another Supreme Court case called Runyon v. McCrary overturns that, says you can't do this. You can't have explicitly racially segregated private schools. You certainly can't have racially segregated public schools, but you also can't have racially segregated private schools. So these academies are still around. They didn't go away. A few of them have closed, but many of them are still in place, and many of them are still significantly racially segregated. But what happens is that these segregation academies have to shift gears. They can't use race now to prohibit access to enrollment in their schools. So they increasingly lean on either high tuition, which will be a bar to poor people who are, again, disproportionately going to be people of color. They also start to lean on what are called legacy admissions, right? So you can go to this school if your parents went to this school. Well, at the time that your parents were going to that school, it was racially segregated. So there aren't going to be any, or if there are, there are going to be very, very few students of color who will be able to get in because in the past, of course, their parents or their grandparents were prohibited from admission. So when we look at these schools today in the 21st century, we still find them to be significantly racially segregated, but most of that is a kind of de facto segregation, which is also true of the public schools. Public schools, in spite of Brown v. Board of Education and in spite of subsequent policies and other Supreme Court decisions, public schools in the United States still remain fairly racially segregated. Part of it is a function of the fact that most schools are based in neighborhood districts, and neighborhood districts, we've talked about racial residential segregation in previous videos. So not surprisingly, right, when your district is comprised primarily of white students or, Black students or Latino students, then it's going to be the case that the schools are fairly racially segregated. So recent Supreme Court cases, which I kind of just alluded to, that have had an impact on this are things like Board of Education of Oklahoma City versus Dowell. This was a 1991 case, and the holding from the majority decision in the case from the U.S. Supreme Court was that the outcome of efforts to desegregate schools, right? So school districts say, we're trying to desegregate our schools. A sensible person might say, all right, so the measure of whether or not the schools are complying with desegregation orders would be sort of a shift in the degree to which those schools are racially segregated. But Board of Education of Oklahoma City versus Dowell held that it isn't really important what the outcome of these efforts are. What's more important is, did the school boards comply with court orders? And have they done what's kind of feasible in order to desegregate, but not really insisting that actual desegregation is the measure of success. Another decision in 2007 was the decision called Parents Involved in Community Schools versus Seattle School District. In this Supreme Court decision, the court held that race can't be used to assign students to schools in voluntary desegregation programs, even if the goal is less segregation. So let me see if you follow that, right? you have a voluntary program in which the people who are participating are explicitly participating so that schools become more desegregated. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, but you can't use race to assign students to schools in an effort to get rid of racial segregation, right? So you can see the way in which the Supreme Court is often deciding cases in favor of a kind of status quo, that the tendency in the I would say in the last 40 to 50 years of jurisprudence from the Supreme Court when it comes to issues of racial inequality and racial discrimination is that the court has gotten very, very reluctant to identify anything as racism that does not explicitly involve somebody saying I'm doing something for explicitly racially discriminatory reasons. So as long as race doesn't get mentioned in, say, for example, pulling people over while they're driving, it's going to be very hard to get a decision from the Supreme Court that will recognize a pattern of discriminatory policing as discriminatory, right? Because for the Supreme Court, they're increasingly leaning on the idea that discrimination can only occur if there is racist intent. And as we know, or at least at this point in the semester, as I hope you know, we can absolutely have racism even in the complete absence of racist intent, right? That's what we mean by institutional race-based discrimination. So these decisions in the post-Brown v. Board of Education era have gotten incredibly sort of esoteric and have in fact actually helped to slow the progress of desegregation efforts that were sort of rolling and sort of underway in earnest in the late 50s and early 60s. All right, so that's a little bit of the legal and contextual sort of background for the things that I want to spend a few minutes talking about here. I want to talk specifically about what racial inequality and what racial and ethnic discrimination in education kind of looks like, right? When we look at these organizations, when we look at these systems, what do we see that is a reflection of or a manifestation of discrimination? And the first thing I'd like to point out is something we call the hidden curriculum. So the hidden curriculum is defined as the sort of unwritten, unofficial, sometimes even unintentional lessons or values or perspectives that students acquire while they're in school. So the hidden curriculum is contrasted with what we call the formal curriculum. The formal curriculum, of course, is the classes that you take, the lessons you learn, the learning activities that all students participate in, as well as, of course, the knowledge and skills that educators intentionally teach to students. That's the formal curriculum. The hidden curriculum, of course, is the stuff that students pick up that's not really part of the overt and obvious sort of curricular intent. I can't remember if we talked about this way back toward the beginning of the semester, but the functional analysis. So the kind of the paradigm that grew out of the work of Emil Durkheim talks about functions, right? The socially beneficial outcomes that come from social activity, social organization, social structure. And they talk about, the functionalists will talk about manifest functions and latent functions, right? Manifest functions being the things that are kind of on the surface, right? The purpose of, a post-secondary educational experience is, the reason why we have colleges is to provide for the intergenerational transfer of skills and knowledge and the credentialing of that process, right? So you take classes and you get a degree or you have a transcript. That's the whole purpose of a place like Harper College. But there are latent functions. There are things that happen at Harper College that aren't part of sort of the formal design of the college that are still socially consequential and in many ways beneficial. So things like students learning how to interact and work with an increasingly diverse population of others. As you move out of your elementary school district into your junior high school district, and from your junior high school you go to your high school, you can see how at each stage of that process the student body is becoming more racially, ethnically, culturally, socially, economically diverse. And that continues, of course, into higher education. So when you're in college, you're gaining a number of socially beneficial things that aren't really part of what the college is sort of overtly and intentionally trying to accomplish. So you could look at the hidden curriculum as a kind of latent function, right? It's all the stuff that students acquire as part of their experience within a school, but it isn't part of the formal curriculum. So students are absorbing lessons that may or may not be part of a formal course of study. They learn how, as I've said, to interact with peers and teachers and other adults. And it's not just in post-secondary education. Obviously, this is stuff that's happening all the way down to the elementary school level. Students are learning how they should perceive different races or groups or classes of people. That's also part of the hidden curriculum. Students are learning what ideas and what behaviors are going to be considered acceptable or unacceptable. And so there's this whole hidden curriculum that's kind of happening at the same time that students are participating in the formal curriculum. And it's really interesting, right, that the lessons of the hidden curriculum, not the formal curriculum, there's a uniformity more or less to the formal curriculum. Every student at the 8th grade level is learning a certain kind of or level of math. They're expected to have a certain level of competency with regard to reading comprehension and writing skills, right? So those things are consistent across all schools. The hidden curriculum varies by the sort of social class composition of the school that students find themselves in. So the hidden curriculum in working class schools is different than the hidden curriculum in middle class schools, and the hidden curriculum in middle class schools is different than the hidden curriculum in upper class schools. So for example, in working class schools, work, right, academic work is sort of defined as following the steps of a procedure, right, and what we call rote, right, so memorization. Remember the process, remember the steps, and that's how you get to the correct answer. The internalized values of the hidden curriculum in working class schools are things like conformity, obedience, punctuality, right, showing up on time, attending, right, those are the things that get stressed consciously or unconsciously in the hidden curriculum of working class schools. And you can see the way in which those values fit with the kind of occupational categories that students coming out of working class schools are most likely to end up in, right? So service sector occupations, what we sort of insultingly call unskilled labor in manufacturing and other production related industries. So again, you got to show up, you got to do what you're told, you got to follow the steps. So those values are kind of getting acquired early on in the process, and they're kind of in place then when students enter into those kinds of occupations. In middle class schools, in the hidden curriculum, work is defined as getting the right answer and figuring out directions. So a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more emphasis on figuring things out for yourself, and that's kind of consistent with the sort of creativity and independent and autonomous sort of activities of people who work in offices and semi-professional and professional occupations. The hidden curriculum in upper class schools is defined by a kind of understanding of work that sees, or a kind of hidden curriculum lesson that sees work as either independent creativity or the development of analytical intellectual powers, right? So independent and critical thinking and creativity get emphasized in upper class schools, and those lessons, those unintended or subtle sort of elements of the hidden curriculum are not at all found in, say, working class schools. So that's one of the manifestation. And again, we're talking about social class, but of course, remember that when we talk about social class in the United States, we are also talking about something that has significant overlap with race. All right. So one of the ways in which this hidden curriculum kind of formalizes, how it gets institutionalized and kind of locked in structurally in these schools, results in a kind of tracking. Now, tracking is an education system in which an entire school population is going to be assigned to classes according to whether the student's overall achievement is above average, normal, or below average. And then students are going to attend academic classes only with students whose overall academic achievement is the same as their own. So students with certain abilities and skills and dispositions are going to be put into some classes and some programs and some tracks. Students with different but shared skills and qualities might be put into a different track, and then another set of students with a different set of attributes or skills or abilities is going to be put into a different track, and it's a way of sort of sorting a student's educational experiences based on where they are relative to other students, right? If you're a below average student, you're going to get tracked into the same kinds of classes and the same kinds of programs as other similarly able students. Every high school that I've ever spent any time sort of interacting with people from, every high school has that science class, because all students have to have science, but it's all the athletes, right? It's if it's a geography or geology class, it's probably like rocks for jocks. I don't think anybody calls it that, but that's kind of the tongue-in-cheek way that it gets referred to, right? There are the classes and the programs and the electives that are sort of that students with particular tendencies or abilities are sort of tracked into. Sometimes more rigidly and formally than others, but it's an effort of us on behalf of the schools to sort of put students in a lane, and that's going to reflect, but it's also going to be a function in many ways of the hidden curriculum. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of the video that there are mechanisms that school systems and education activists and other people who are kind of in the orbit of addressing issues with regard to education, there are mechanisms that people are using and have used to try to address racially segregated schools. Mixed results, but one of the things that has been tried in the past is what's called desegregation busing. This is a set of programs that are designed to mix races in public education by busing children from predominantly African American or sometimes Latino neighborhoods into predominantly white neighborhood schools. Very, very famous example of this in the 1970s was in Boston, right? So in Boston, the school system at the city level was trying to find ways to desegregate their racially segregated schools. And the solution that they tried was basically to take kids from predominantly African American parts of the city and bus them into predominantly white neighborhoods to attend the schools in those neighborhoods. And people, sort of significantly and very visibly pushed back. There were riots and demonstrations and attempts on the part of parents in these white neighborhoods and activists in these white neighborhoods to sort of forcibly keep the black students out of their community. Another mechanism that people use to try to desegregate schools or to deal with already segregated schools is to create racially mixed classrooms. So using race as a kind of criteria to sort people into classes or assign them to classes in a way that create racially mixed um, classrooms that contain pupils from a variety of racial backgrounds, with the idea that, again, it's kind of that contact hypothesis that we talked about way back at the beginning of the semester that says that when diverse students interact with each other as peers in an environment where they are kind of situationally equal, the biases and prejudices that are acquired, passively through socialization, sometimes intentionally through socialization, begin to erode. Right, that positive interactions with people from other racial and ethnic groups lead to a diminution of racial prejudice toward those racial and ethnic groups. Another mechanism was the establishment of what we call magnet schools. Magnet schools are public schools with special programs and instruction that aren't really available elsewhere in a school district, and that are designed to draw students from all over a school district, specifically with the purpose of trying to aid in desegregating schools. So in my own junior high school and high school experience, I attended magnet schools. I grew up in a predominantly white part of the city of Tulsa, specifically the east side of the city. As we've talked about in the context of the Tulsa race riot, most of the black people in the city of Tulsa then and today still live on the north side of the city. So on the north side of the city, there were two magnet schools, Carver Middle School, and then Booker T. Washington High School. Both of those were magnet schools. They were not the schools that I was supposed to go to. My district would have had me go to Skelly for junior high school, and either Nathan Hale or I believe East Central for high school. And those were the schools that all my friends went to, right? Because all of my friends, when I was growing up, they were going to go to the schools in district. But I ended up going to this magnet school for junior high school and then for high school, in part because they had all kinds of different classes that I couldn't get at, Skelly or at either of the two high schools that I was sort of supposed to go to. They had, a disproportionately high number of like AP classes. They had a wide variety of language classes, none of which I actually took. But the point here is they have these programs and these instructors. We had a lot of like PhD instructors in my high school, right? So you have these schools that are designed to sort of be attractive to people who are outside of the district, and they will be drawn to those schools, kind of like, drawn to a magnet. And because they're going to be coming from predominantly white areas of the city, they're going to have the effect of desegregating or helping to desegregate a predominantly African American or Latino school. So magnet schools are another mechanism to kind of create some desegregation. Couple more things I want to talk about with regard to kind of the present state of things, and sort of what we see when we look at public schools in the United States in the late 20th and now the very early 21st century. And I want to start by talking about a book that was written in 1991 by a guy named Jonathan Kozol, who's a former teacher. The book was called Savage Inequalities. He was a teacher. He noticed that the schools in his district where he was teaching were sort of very, very different from one another in terms of the quality of the buildings, the furniture, the physical plant of the schools were different. The resources that were available in the schools were different, and he sort of began to sort of systematically look at the way in which not all schools kind of look and operate the same way. So he did this extensive sort of research. And as I said, in 1991, ended up writing this kind of groundbreaking book called Savage Inequalities, in which he kind of presented the results of his efforts to study this kind of disparate and discriminatory funding that exists in public schools in the United States. And what he found was that U.S. public schools shortchange poor rural and poor urban schools. So obviously, we're talking about mechanisms that take money from affluent communities and spend it on schools in those affluent communities. And in places where there isn't a lot of money, rural areas and poor urban areas, those schools are going to be underfunded. We've talked about this before as an example of institutional race-based discrimination. So suburban schools do a lot better by comparison. That was one of the big findings of this book. And of course, what happens, this is not necessarily in the book, but this is a lesson that we can draw. We understand that institutions are interconnected, that no institution exists in a vacuum. So if there's inequality in one institutional space within a society, then those inequalities are going to manifest or be reproduced in other institutional spaces. So you go to an underfunded and underperforming public school for junior high school and high school, that's going to have an impact on what kind of colleges and universities you can get into. Your ability to access quality higher education is going to have an impact on the kind of job that you're going to get after you graduate, because your credential or the nature of your credential is going to be affected. And you're going to be competing in an environment where people are coming from better educational backgrounds if you're coming from an underfunded educational background. So those patterns, aren't new. They've been around for a while. But even though we spent a lot of time in the last few decades of the 20th century, the patterns of inequality that Kozel described in Savage Inequalities are still largely in place, right? Because one of the things we haven't done in any significant way over the last 40 or 50 years is to fundamentally restructure how we fund higher education. And that's a deep and ongoing persistent problem. Another area where we see racial discrimination in education has to do with school discipline, right? So school discipline has to do with the way in which schools, and even within schools, how classrooms are managed with regard to the behavior of students. And one of the things that really started to become popular in the 1980s and 90s was the rise of what were called zero tolerance policies, right? So if a student was found to be in violation of the school rules, zero tolerance meant that students could be sort of expelled or they could be put on suspension much more easily. And of course, zero tolerance was much more likely, not surprisingly, I suspect to any of you, much more likely to be enforced in poor schools than in affluent schools, which of course then means it's also more likely to be enforced in minority schools compared to white schools. So we see, even in things like school discipline, if we have a predominantly white school, law enforcement, for example, is much less likely to be called in to resolve a dispute or a conflict in the school, whereas in schools that are predominantly populated by minority group members, law enforcement is much more likely to be drawn in, which means that, especially when we get to high school level education, students are much more likely to get arrested. And if you get arrested, now you have a record. And if you have a record, it's good, right? So you can see the way that creates a little bit of a snowball and a ripple effect that, again, sort of propagates out through other institutional areas in society. We even see, weirdly enough, we see now in the early 21st century, we see efforts that are increasingly designed to sort of roll back some of the few gains that have actually been achieved in desegregating and in creating more equitable educational environments for all students in the United States. In May of 2022, Texas Governor Greg Abbott announced an intent to challenge a Supreme Court precedent called Plyler v. Doe. Plyler v. Doe was a 1982 case that held that states are required to educate all students. You might say, well, of course, why wouldn't they? But this was meant to address discrimination towards students based on their immigration status. This 1982 case said that immigration status cannot be used to bar access to public schools. In announcing that he intends to challenge this, what Greg Abbott is essentially saying is that the state of Texas is taking a stand that it should not be in any way obligated to teach students who are here as a result of being brought here as children, right? So DACA children, people who were brought here as kids, have never lived in any other country for any appreciable amount of time, will suddenly be denied an ability to get an education. And if you can't get an education, it's going to be harder for you to, of course, hold down a job. If you can't hold down a job, it's going to be much more likely that you won't be in a position to sort of resist efforts to deport you and repatriate you back into a country which, as I just said, you've really never lived in. It's ugly. It's really, and it's overtly sort of, well, it's racist. I don't really know how to sugarcoat it, and maybe I shouldn't try. Right? It's just a really nasty, ugly sort of thing that that doesn't really benefit anybody, but it allows this guy to sort of say, "Look, we're taking a stand against immigration," even though that's clearly not going to have any impact at all on immigration. And then the last thing, of course, and this one is something that we've kind of talked about on and off over the course of the semester, but it's probably a good time to circle back and remind everybody about this. The disproportionate funding of public education in the United States, specifically through the use of property taxes as a way to fund K through 12 education, creates a racially discriminatory outcome. And again, it reflects a very interesting rural/urban versus suburban bias, right? That poor areas tend to be in rural areas and certain parts of cities. Suburbs tend to be a little bit more affluent. There's a little bit of a shift, right? We see a rising amount of suburban poverty over the last 30 or 40 years, but we really still see the greatest economic disparities between rural areas and urban areas of urban poverty versus suburban areas. And what happens then, of course, is that the students in that first group of rural and poor urban areas tend to go to underfunded public schools, creating an advantage for the students who are attending suburban schools, which tend to be much more fully and appropriately funded. So the disproportionate funding mechanism in higher education is also a huge problem. All right, so I think that's about enough. Next time we'll talk about criminal justice, see some of the ways in which discrimination sort of shows up there. Probably not going to be anything too shocking or new to most of you, but maybe some of the details will be interesting. And again, I'll do a little bit of trying to contextualize and provide a little bit of a historical framework for how we got to a point where there's such a great disparity in policing along racial and ethnic lines. As always, if you have any questions, reach out, let me know, and if not, I will just see you guys next time. Take care.